welcome to my channel. This is Elizabeth with Wandering Soul Enterprises. Glad to be back after a long break, and here today to bring you a video talking about Astrology 101 geared towards beginners. And so first I'm going to explain why I wanted to make this video, and then I'll share a few helpful tips and resources to help get you started reading your birth chart, reading your horoscope with more in-depth knowledge. And then finally we'll go through my flashcards to help you learn the vocabulary, the glyphs, and some keywords so that you can develop and apply your knowledge when reading your birth chart or your daily, weekly, or monthly horoscope. So it's really geared for beginners, but anybody can tune in and maybe you'll find something useful if you feel called to watch. So let's go ahead and get started. So part one, why I wanted to make this video. So first of all, I just want to clarify that I don't consider myself to be a professional astrologer by any means. I'm not trained in astrology. I'm just self-taught. I'm a beginner like you. And I wanted to make this video because I've been interested in astrology for many years, and I always loved reading my horoscope, but I wanted to learn more about the methodology that goes into interpreting a birth chart and in writing a horoscope. So I started Googling astrology and trying to learn about it, and I found that it was very overwhelming because there's a vast body of information out there. Some of it's conflicting and some of it's confusing. So my goal here is to create some content that introduces a more simple approach to learn the basics of astrology and just kind of sets forth a clear pathway forward to help get you started. So part two, tips and resources to help get you started. So tip number one, I recommend going to Cafe Astrology, or there's other websites out there too where you can print up a free copy of your birth chart. And I have a little example birth chart that I cut out here. In order to print your birth chart, you're going to need to know the date, time, and location of your birth. Luckily, I was able to ask my mom and she somehow knew that. So that helped me. You can also look at your birth certificate, or if you don't know, you can also come up with an approximation, but it's best if you know the exact time and location. You'll also need to make a decision on which zodiac system to use and which type of house calculation system to use. So for the zodiac systems, there's two major systems. There's tropical, which is the Western astrology system, and then there's sidereal, which is used in Vedic astrology. So I made the decision to go with tropical. So what we're going to be talking about today, this birth chart that I've got here, is based on tropical. I'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a second. There's some differences between the two systems. Another thing is there's different types of ways to calculate the houses, and honestly, I'm not advanced enough of a practitioner yet to really tell you what all the differences and nuances are. So I just went with whole sign houses because it just seemed the most approachable, the most basic and simple. So tropical whole sign houses, that's what I'd recommend to get started, especially if you're a Westerner. If you're from India or somewhere else where they use sidereal, you might want to start with that instead if you're more familiar with that system. But I think most of us in the US probably more familiar with the tropical system anyway, so it might just be more approachable. So what's the difference between tropical and sidereal? So tropical zodiac is based on the sun's apparent path around the earth. You know, back when astrology first got started, people thought the earth was flat and that all the heavenly bodies orbited around the earth. So the tropical zodiac is based on the sun's apparent path around the earth. It's called the ecliptic. And tropical is really tied to the equinoxes, the solstices, the seasons, and the wheel of the year. whereas sidereal astrology is based upon the position of the sun in relation to the other constellations as they appear in the night sky. And so thousands of years ago, when astrology was first being developed, these two zodiacs were essentially the same, but over the years, due to the wobble of the Earth, the constellations have shifted so that now, so I'm an Aquarius sun, okay? So the constellation of Aquarius thousands of years ago was located in the sign of Aquarius under the tropical system. But these days, the actual constellation of Aquarius is located in the constellation of the actual constellation of Aquarius is located in the sign of Capricorn. So that's one of the drawbacks of using tropical astrology, is that the constellations themselves are not located in the signs. But I still think there's some benefits to using tropical as well, because again, it's tied in with the wheel of the year and the seasons, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different modalities of the signs. And I think when we start talking about the modalities, you might start to see how the signs have other symbolism and meanings beyond just the constellations that were originally within them. And so I think tropical is really useful for tying in that seasonal energy of your sign, and taking advantage of the equinox and the solstices and all of that. Plus, it's just more traditional for those of us who are from the West. But that said, I know of an astrologer called Vic DeCara, and he practices tropical astrology for your horoscope and birth chart. But when he starts talking about Vedic astrology and your nakshatras, your lunar mansions, then he switches over to the sidereal system. So I think eventually when I start to dig into Vedic astrology and the nakshatras, I'm probably going to look at that aspect of my chart from the sidereal perspective. Okay? So tip number 2 is to determine your ascendant or rising sign. Learn where your houses are, your houses for your chart, and start reading your daily horoscope based on your rising sign, not on your sun sign. Why? Okay, so that brings me to tip number 3, which is to divorce the zodiac signs from the houses. Okay, so despite what modern astrologers might say, the houses are not ruled by the signs. The zodiac signs each have a planetary ruler, so the signs are ruled by planets. But your houses are determined based on your rising sign on your birth chart. And your rising sign is your first house, and then it goes around in a circle from there. So there's a lot of confusion about this topic, and you'll see it all the time. I see it all the time on tarot videos where they're also trying to incorporate astrology. They'll say things like the 8th house is ruled by Scorpio, the 11th house is ruled by Aquarius. You'll see it in all kinds of articles and resources, but it's not true. And here's the reason for the confusion. Here's why you see that so often in all these different places. So back in the 1970s and the 80s, astrologers started publishing pop astrology columns in newspapers and magazines. Back then we didn't have the internet, so it wasn't easy to print up a free copy of your natal chart to find your rising sign. And in order to get a copy of your birth chart, you really would need to consult with a professional astrologer to obtain that information, so it wasn't really available to the masses. So in order to make the daily horoscope columns more palatable to the general public, astrologers started just publishing the range of dates for your sun sign right next to the name of the zodiac sign. And people started reading their horoscope based on their sun sign, but really for each of those zodiac signs, the things that are happening and the transits they're talking about are really based on the assumption that that's your rising sign. So essentially what they started to do was to conflate the signs and the houses. Because it's easy to figure out what your sun sign is based on your birthday, but it's a little harder to figure out your rising sign because you have to know the time of birth and your location of birth and have your chart drawn up. So then they started saying Aries rules the first house. Aries is the first sign in the zodiac, so Aries rules the first house, and Taurus rules the second house, etc., etc. So by doing this, they were basically breaking with thousands of years of the traditional methods developed by astrologers from ancient times. So it's kind of unfortunate because now it's really prevalent all over the place and it's very confusing. But in order to understand how the daily transits affect various aspects of your life, you need to look at what's happening in your houses based on your rising sign. And yes, I'm a beginning astrologer, so you don't have to take it from me. If you have questions about this, I highly recommend tuning into the Astrology podcast with Chris Brennan. I'll post a link to that channel in the description box below. And when I started watching his series about the houses, that's when they explained this whole situation about divorcing the signs from the houses, and it was like a dam broke open in my mind, and suddenly everything started to make sense. And now I'm reading my horoscopes based on my rising sign rather than my sun sign, and it's making a big difference. So that was tip number 3. Okay, so tip number 4, that brings me to resources to help you get started. Number 1, the Astrology podcast. It's a great resource. They're so informative, so knowledgeable. They stick to the traditional methods. And I'm hoping that this video will help prepare you with the vocabulary you need to understand what the heck they're talking about on the Astrology podcast, because it's pretty high level, I think. And I do especially recommend tuning into their series on the houses and the one about the signs. And then they also do these annual and monthly deep dives into each sign based on your rising sign. So I really recommend the Astrology podcast. Also, if you happen to see a copy of the Farmer's Almanac while you're out buying plants or whatever, I always recommend that. They have the important transits listed there and lots of other useful information for how you can tie astrology in with your daily life. And then there's a website called astrology.com. And if you click on the Learn tab, there's a calendar that shows all the major transits every month. So once you start to learn these different glyphs and the aspects that we're going to go over today, you can start looking at that calendar and figure out what that means to you in terms of your chart and your houses. And then I didn't bring it out here with me, but there's a company called the Honeywell Collective, and you can go on there and print out a personal astrology almanac. And I did that one year. I think they sponsored one of the Astrology podcast videos, and I bought into it. And it was a useful resource, but honestly, I think it's a little more advanced than what I needed. And then, you know, if you want to take it to the next level, you could invest in Ephemeris, or better yet, like I think it's called SolarFire, the software where you can draw up a chart from any day, at any point in history or in the future. That's what if you really want to nerd out on astrology, I think that's the next step, which I have not taken yet, but maybe someday, I don't know. So those are some tips and resources for you. And now we'll move on to part 3, the flashcards. So I have a bunch of flashcards here. A lot of them have the glyphs on here. So I'm just going to kind of go through them really quickly, throw out some keywords and themes to help you associate each of these concepts with its meaning and symbolism. We're going to talk about the 12 houses, the 4 angles, the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 4 elements and how those are tied in with the signs, the 3 modalities and how those are tied in with the signs. We'll also talk about the planets and asteroids, the lunar nodes, the major aspects, and we'll also talk about lunations. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start by talking about the houses. So it's really important again to determine your first house, and that is going to be the house of your rising sign. So your rising sign is the sign of the zodiac that is rising on the eastern horizon at the time of your birth. Okay? So that rising sign, your first house, is called the helm. And this is about the self, the body, the character, and the appearance. And then the second house is called the Gate of Hades. And it has to do with your personal finances, your money attitude, your food, your possessions, and your income. So this is like your personal resources. The third house is the house of the goddess. And it has to do with siblings, short trips, primary education, your local community, and daily communication like text, emails, phone calls, that kind of thing, as opposed to like major communication like writing a book or something like that. That's more of a ninth house thing. The fourth house is called the subterranean because the fourth house is located below the earth at the time of your birth. And this regards your parents, your home, your family, and private life. So it's kind of like your roots. The fifth house is the house of good fortune. And this has to do with children, creativity, pleasure, and sex. That's right. The fifth house is the house that tells you about your sex life, not the eighth house. And that has to do with that whole thing about modern astrologers conflating the houses with the signs, because the eighth sign is Scorpio, and Scorpio has to do with sex. So they started saying, oh, well, the eighth house has to do with sex because it's ruled by Scorpio. But that's actually not the case. Scorpio has to do with sex, and the fifth house has to do with sex, not the eighth house. Okay, so the sixth house is the house of bad fortune. You know, traditional astrologers, they're very, black or white, good or bad. So the sixth house has to do with illness, injuries, work, subordinates, and enemies. And then the seventh house is the setting house. And so this is going to be the house that's on the western horizon at the time of your birth. And this has to do with relationships, partnership, marriage, and it can also, it's usually like romantic relationships and partnerships, but it could also include your BFFs and your homies. So that's the seventh house. Your important relationships, close friends. And then the eighth house is called the inactive house. And this does have to do with death, inheritance, and other people's assets. So it's like the death and taxes house. Nothing sexy there. Unless, I think they did mention on the Astrology podcast, like, well, if you were married to somebody and they die, then you might get an inheritance from them, and maybe you had sex with them at one point because you were married. But that's kind of it. The ninth house is the house of the god. And this is about travel, foreign things, education. It can be about that writing a book, that big communication. And it also has to do with religion, but to me, even more so, it's about spirituality. So that spiritual journey is really a ninth house issue. And then there's the 10th house, the midheaven. So this is going to be the house that's like at the top of the sky at the time that you're born. And this has to do with your career, your actions, your reputation, and your public life. So it's, what's visible. It's the most visible house of the houses. The 11th house is the house of good spirit. So this is about your casual friendships, your acquaintances, friends, groups, alliances, and hopes. And so this is more of like, you know, if you're going to a business conference or something might be going on in your 11th house. And then the 12th house is the house of bad spirit. And this is also about enemies, but I think they say usually this is more for hidden enemies, whereas the 6th house is like in your face enemies. This is also the house of self-undoing, sickness, loss, seclusion, and suffering. Pretty sad. That's the 12th house. Part of life, right? It's all part of the cycle of life. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 angles. So the angles tell you where the path of the sun is on your chart. So the ascendant is on the eastern horizon, and it's usually going to be in your 1st house. That's also the house of your rising sign. The descendant is going to be on the western horizon, and that's usually going to be your 7th house, or the setting house. The midheaven is at the high noon location, and that's usually going to be your 10th house. And I don't know how to pronounce this, but I think it's Imum Coeli, the IC, is the midnight house. So that's going to be under the earth at the time of your birth, and this is where your 4th house is located most of the time, the subterranean. So next, let's talk about zodiac signs. First sign of the zodiac is Aries, and this sign is ruled by the planet Mars. It's a fire sign and a cardinal sign, and Aries is competitive, athletic, argumentative, a leader, and takes initiative. Taurus is a fixed sign. It's an earth sign ruled by Venus, and Taurus is stubborn, sensual, maybe a chef. They're into comfort, beauty, slowness, and rest, and routines. Gemini is a mutable sign. It's an air sign, and it's ruled by Mercury. And Gemini is talkative, friendly, a little bit scattered, extroverted, maybe sometimes nosy, analytical, adaptable, intelligent, and curious. Cancer is the cardinal sign, a water sign ruled by the moon, and Cancer is emotional, moody, nurturing, clingy, protective, and have a high need for security. Leo is a fixed fire sign ruled by the sun, and Leo is warm, generous, dramatic, playful, lighthearted, and dominant. Virgo is a mutable earth sign ruled by Mercury. Virgo is gentle, kind, into personal hygiene, a little bit fastidious, maybe fussy, very humble, analytical, critical, and responsible. Libra is a cardinal air sign, also ruled by Venus. And Libra is balanced. They're into peace and justice. They dislike conflict. They're charming. They're into art and beauty, cooperative, gracious. At times they can be a little bit self-obsessed, tyrannical, controlling, and sometimes indecisive because they're always weighing the pros and cons of everything. So sometimes indecisive. And they can also be pretty diplomatic. Sometimes they can be troublemakers who cause conflict in their shadow aspect, but more often they're conflict averse and tend to be people pleasers. and they can sometimes be fake nice or dishonest. Scorpio is a fixed water sign, traditionally ruled by Mars, but they also have a modern ruler, Pluto, so they have a co-ruler. And Scorpio is about sex, violence, they're obsessive, into the occult, death, rebirth, transformation, shape-shifting. And when Scorpio gets mad, they really have a sting because they're Scorpion, and they can be jealous, secretive, and resentful. And they tend to value loyalty and honesty in others, but not necessarily so much in themselves. And Sagittarius is a mutable fire sign ruled by Jupiter. Sagittarius loves adventure, taking risks. They're goal-oriented, they're easygoing, philosophical, friendly, independent, confident, self-righteous, and sometimes blunt. Actually, I know a few Sagittarians, and I can definitely vouch for all of those good and bad traits. Let's see. So Capricorn. Capricorn is a cardinal sign. It's an earth sign, and it's ruled by Saturn. And Capricorn, on the Astrology podcast, I think they said Capricorn is like the mullet of the zodiac because they love to work hard, but they can also party harder than anybody else. And Capricorn has this philosophy that things must be done a certain way, and that's the traditional way, the way things have always been done. They're very organized, very pragmatic, and very disciplined, and also kind of cold. They're a winter sign, and they're ruled by Saturn, which is also kind of cold. Saturn's all about boundaries and discipline. So then next we have Aquarius, which is a fixed air sign, which is also ruled by Saturn, but Aquarius has a co-ruler, Uranus. So that brings a little bit of the unexpected to the Aquarius sign. Aquarius is aloof, analytical, eccentric, free-spirited, unusual, nonconformist, and they have high ideals for humanity. And Aquarians, like Capricorn, also think that things must be done a certain way, but rather than thinking that things must be done the traditional way, Aquarius thinks things must be done a certain way by improving the system. We have these high ideals and think that humanity ought to do things better than they do. So that's Aquarius. And humanity doesn't really seem to want to cooperate most of the time, if you ask me. And then our last sign of the zodiac is Pisces. And Pisces is a mutable water sign, traditionally ruled by Jupiter, but in modern astrology, it also has a co-ruler, Neptune. And I always tend to think of Neptune first when I think about Pisces, but it's really cool that Jupiter is their ruler as well. Jupiter's all about expansion and benevolence. So Pisces is sensitive, self-aware, creative, romantic, sensuous, maybe a little gullible, malleable, adaptive, empathic, psychic, intuitive, gentle, passive, compassionate, dreamy, confused, shy, lazy, and they tend to dwell in sadness and brooding. I can relate because I have a Pisces moon, so. All right, so let's talk about the elements a little bit. You might have noticed as we were going through the different signs, each sign has an element that it's associated with. So we're going to talk about that. It's earth, air, fire, or water. So the earth element is symbolized by a downward pointing triangle with a line through it. And Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn are all earth signs. And earth is about health, wealth, stability, structure, and practical matters. If you think about it, like if you built a house out of earthen bricks, it's very insulating, very comforting. So That's Earth for you. The air signs, or the element of air, is symbolized by an upward pointing triangle with a line through it. And the air signs are Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra. And air signs are about thoughts, words, communication, ideas, freedom, wind, change, and cooling. So the element of fire is symbolized by an upward pointing triangle with no line, and the zodiac signs associated with fire are Leo, Sagittarius, and Aries. And fire is about heat, passion, inspiration, warmth, energy, and action. And then water is symbolized by a downward pointing triangle. And the water signs are Scorpio, Cancer, and Pisces. And water is about the emotions, fluidity, intuition, mystery, hydration, and cooling. So now let's talk about the modalities. You might have heard as we were going through the different signs of the zodiac, each sign is either a cardinal sign, a fixed sign, or a mutable sign. And the modalities tell us where the zodiac sign falls on the wheel of the year. So cardinal signs signal the beginning of a season, and they symbolize new beginnings, ambition, and initiative. So the cardinal signs are Capricorn, which happens at the beginning of winter, Yule, or the winter solstice. Aries, which happens at the beginning of spring and begins with Ostara, the vernal equinox. Cancer, which heralds the beginning of summer, which is associated with the holiday of Litha and the summer solstice. And then Libra starts the beginning of fall, and it's associated with Mabon and the autumnal equinox. So yeah, the cardinal signs always signal the beginning of a season based on the equinox or solstice. And then the fixed signs are in the middle of the season. So Aquarius is in the dead of winter when it's cold. Taurus is in the spring, the middle of spring, so it symbolizes fertility. Leo is in the middle of summer, so abundance and warmth. Scorpio is in the middle of fall, so it's that transformative energy. And the fixed signs are all very stubborn because they embody the full energy of the season and the element that it's associated with. See, this is why I like tropical, because you don't get with sidereal, these seasons shift over time, so it's kind of nice to look at things through the tropical lens for this reason. A mutable sign is gentle, changing, and adaptive, and the mutable signs happen at the end of the season, so that's when things are kind of winding down and changing into the next. So Pisces is the end of winter, Gemini happens at the end of spring, Virgo happens at the end of summer, and Sagittarius happens at the end of fall. So mutable signs are passive, they let things happen, they're easygoing, they go with the flow. Right? So next let's talk about the planets and asteroids. The moon symbolizes emotions, illusion, monthly cycles, feminine energy, mystery, darkness, reflection, fear, the unknown, tides, and fertility. Mercury is about travel, commerce, and communication. Venus is about love, beauty, sex, money, gambling, profane wine, fertility, and motherhood. The sun is about truth, illumination, divine masculine energy, power, fertility, the self, warmth, and happiness. Mars is about sex, virility, power, action, violence, fertility, aggression, and domination. Jupiter is about expansion, benevolence. It's father energy, daddy energy, and husband energy, but from a benevolent aspect. Saturn is about restriction, boundaries, and rules. So Saturn is also sort of a fatherly energy, but it's more about that discipline aspect rather than Jupiter being more benevolent. Jupiter buys the cotton candy. Saturn will ground you from video games. Uranus is the wild card sign. It's unexpected, full of surprise and rebellion. So you can imagine how messed up it is as an Aquarius to have Saturn and Uranus as your co-rulers. Okay. Neptune, it's about water, tides, the emotions, creativity, the unknown, mystery, and confusion. So whenever Neptune's hanging around, things get a little confusing, but also kind of poetic and creative. And then Pluto. Pluto is about death, rebirth, transformation, and endings. So Pluto moves really slowly through the zodiac, and we're going to be having a big transit. Actually, we're kind of getting a little taste of it right now. Pluto is moving into Aquarius, and it's going to move back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn this year. And then I think the end of this year or early next year, it's going to move into Aquarius for the next 19 years. So major transformation in whatever house on your chart is where Aquarius is located. So for me, Aquarius is in my 7th house. So I'm expecting some major transformations with relationships and partnerships and things, which is probably good because I've been single for way too long. Okay. So now I'm getting into the asteroids. Those are all the planets, the heavenly bodies. There's 7 traditional planets, but we also have Neptune and Pluto and Uranus added into the mix now, thanks to modern astrology. So Chiron is the wounded healer. That's the symbol for Chiron. Vesta is about the home, the hearth, eternal flames, devotion, vigil, and Vestal virgins. So it's also about purity, I would say. Juno is wife energy, and Juno regulates marriage, protection of women from domestic violence, childbirth, domestic matters, and household management. Ceres is the goddess of agriculture, the spring and fall seasons, the wheel of the year, motherly love, nourishment, and nurturing. And Pallas Athena, is associated with wisdom and the arts. So those are, I think there's more asteroids than that, but those are the main ones that I know of. And then one more thing you'll see on your chart are the lunar nodes. So the lunar nodes are the points in the sky where the moon's orbit crosses the ecliptic. Remember, the ecliptic is the apparent pathway of the sun around the earth, because people used to think the earth was flat and the planets, the heavenly bodies all orbited around the earth. So the ecliptic is the apparent path of the sun's motion on the celestial sphere as seen from the earth, and the nodes are the intersection of the moon's path with the sun's path. So the South Node looks kind of like this, although this is, you know, my artistic abilities coming through here. It's like an upside down horseshoe, wait, or I don't know. That's the South Node anyway. So the South Node represents where you're coming from and what you're bringing with you into this life. So it's all about your soul's purpose, your soul's path. It's pretty interesting. And then the North Node is the life path you're destined for in this lifetime. So you're kind of moving from your South Node with the resources that you have from your past lives, etc., and moving toward your destiny in this lifetime. So see which houses, which signs your North Node and South Node are located in. That can give you some big clues on your soul's purpose in this life. And then we need to talk about the aspects. So aspects are the connections between the planets on your chart. And the aspect line connects planets across the middle of the chart, and the angle is measured with the vertex at the center of the chart. I felt like I needed to say this. Maybe I'm just a geometry nerd or something, but I don't feel like anybody kind of quite explains this. So you take your chart and you draw a dot in the middle of the chart. You get a protractor and put the little circle of the protractor right where the dot is. And then you can measure the angles between the different planets on your chart. And these lines here kind of show the line between the planets, but you would measure the angle between those planets. So let's just look at this particular chart. If you can see the straight line here down the middle of the chart, I'm going to put the protractor there. Okay, so that's a 180 degree angle. That means that this line here is showing an opposition. So in this chart, we have Mercury in the 10th house of Libra opposed to opposed to Uranus in the 4th house in Aries. Okay, so what might that mean? Like, there's going to be some sort of like communication issues because we've got Mercury in Libra in the 10th house. That's very public. So like the way you present yourself and speak in public is opposed to your 4th house, which is more private. Aries, that's dealing with leadership and your roots. And we've got Uranus down here, so it's about rebellion. So there's some sort of like rebelliousness opposed to your communication skills. So your communication to the outward world is coming from like a rebellious place, and maybe it's hard to kind of balance those two things at times. I don't know. That's my interpretation. I'm sure a more experienced astrologer could expound on that. But that's basically how you measure the aspects on your chart. Like, you could measure, let's see if we can find another one here. So, yeah, we've got like a 90 degree angle between Venus in Leo and Mars in Scorpio. Ooh, that's a square. A 90 degree angle is going to be a square. So with Venus in Leo in the 8th house, those are both about love too, Mars and Venus, right? So there's a square there. There's some opposition. Squares are difficult energy, right? So we've got Venus in Leo in the 8th house. So that's about death, taxes, other people's money in Leo, which is about creativity, domination, wanting to be in control, also playfulness and drama. And that's squared with Mars in the 11th house, which is about networking, acquaintances, and that's also in Scorpio. So we've got double Mars energy there. So there's going to be a lot of kind of butting heads and kind of seeing part of the situation, but not the whole situation there between those two aspects. I'll get into the aspects a little bit more here. So, major aspects. So let's start with a conjunction. A conjunction is a 0-degree angle, which means the two planets are lined up with each other within the same sign. Like a couple of years ago, we had the Great Conjunction where Jupiter and Saturn were lined up with each other in Aquarius. And a conjunction blends the energy of those two planets. And it's usually, well, it can be positive, but it just depends on what those planets are and where they're located, basically. And then a sextile is a 60-degree angle between the two planets. And sextiles are usually, when you have a sextile, those two planets are going to be located in compatible elements. So compatible elements would be water and earth, because the water nourishes the earth. And then fire and air, because fire needs air to happen in order to happen. So they're not the same element, but they're compatible. And a sextile will also bring in a collaborative aspect, and it's positive and easy. So yeah, a lot of times in your horoscope, if they're talking about how these two planets are working together with each other, they might be talking about a sextile. A square is a 90-degree angle, and squares can be negative and challenging. If the two planets are squared, that means they're in the same modality. So they're either fixed or cardinal or muted, and a square is an impasse. So especially if you have a square between two fixed signs, ooh, that's really tough, really stubborn energy. A trine is a 120-degree angle, and trines are positive and easy. This is where the planets hold hands, the energy flows easily, and I think in a trine, the planets are going to be in the same element as well. And then the downside of a trine is like, maybe if you have too many trines in your birth chart, maybe your life's gonna be too easy. You won't have enough opportunity for growth. At least that's what the rest of us say, because we've got it hard. And then opposition is a 180-degree angle, so that's when they're right across from each other. It's a straight line, if you recall from geometry class. And oppositions are negative, challenging, and that's where you can see the other side. You can see where they're coming from, but it's hard to make a decision. Oppositions can involve projection onto others, or also internal conflict between two different options. All right, so we're almost done here. The last thing I wanted to talk about is lunations. So these are the 8 phases of the moon. And a lot of the information that I have on these flashcards came from Dane Rudyard's Lunations. So you might want to check him out as well. I'll see if I can find a link to his work. I did these a long time ago, but I thought that his explanations were really helpful. So this is the glyph for a new moon. And new moons symbolize birth, new beginnings, taking initiative, creativity, and emergence. So on a new moon, it's a good time to do a ritual where you set intentions and things like that, start new things. The crescent moon, also known as the waxing crescent, is about challenges, effort, change, activity, and expansion. So this is when you start to grow and work towards the goals or intentions that you set on the new moon. The first quarter moon is about willpower, organization, decision making, and pushing through obstacles. So it's that stick to it energy. Keep going, keep going. The waxing gibbous moon is about development, evaluation, perfecting, and overcoming. So good time to make edits on the paper that you're writing, that kind of thing. So you'll see like During this waxing phase, it's a growth phase. It's where we're applying more energy, we're working towards manifesting our goal, and it's a good time for planting new seeds. If you read the Farmer's Almanac, a good time to fertilize the garden, things like that. The full moon is a time of culmination, illumination, objectivity, vision, fulfillment, and reflection. So it's time to celebrate and take stock of where you've come from, and a time to express gratitude for all your blessings and to reap what you've sown. And then the disseminating moon is also called the waning gibbous moon. And this is a good time for teaching, reaping again what you've sown, maturity, communication, and demonstration. Those are all Dane Rudyard's ideas. I really like that though. The last quarter moon is about assimilation, harvest, and reorientation. Right? Kind of like reassessing. And he's calling this the balsamic moon, but I would also call it the waning crescent. This is about death, transition, and release. So the waning crescent is the time for letting things go. Good time to pull the weeds from the garden. And then one final note about eclipses. So the solar eclipse is when the moon is in between the earth and the sun, and the lunar eclipse is when the earth is between the sun and the moon. Right? Yeah, I think so. So a solar eclipse will always happen on a new moon. Solar eclipse will always happen on a new moon. A lunar eclipse will always happen on a full moon. And the eclipse happens when the new or full moon aligns with the ecliptic, the sun's path, and also it lines up with the nodes of fate. Eclipse energy can be chaotic, intense, challenging, powerful, and destabilizing. So it's not really a good time for doing intention setting or manifesting. It's better for doing journaling, meditation, and just kind of sitting back and processing energy. So just a little word about eclipses. All right, so that brings us to the end of our talk. In conclusion, I hope that this video has been helpful, hopefully provided some clarification to help you deepen your understanding of astrology. And I hope that you find the study of astrology as fascinating as I do. You know, if you think about it, astrology and astronomy were at one time one and the same, and all of our world's calendars and our ways of keeping time are based on astrology. And it's also interwoven with all of the world's major religions and spiritual belief systems, all the 7 chakras, the 7 heavens. Those are all tied in with astrology as well. All the myths are based on the stories of the planets moving through the constellations. So it's just a really important part of our history, lots of important archetypes, and it's an intuitive art informed by science. So it's a beautiful thing. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Comment below with any thoughts or questions you might have. I'll do my best to respond. And I hope to see you again, and hope to be bringing more content out here soon. I know it's been kind of slow going, but I appreciate all my subscribers for coming back, and hope to see you next time. Thanks. Bye.